Antonio's hand gripped the door handle, his eyes cold. He was entering a world he'd never needed to care about, until now. Isabella had crossed a line. She thought she could hide her life from him, pretend he didn't know. Tonight, he was going to expose everything. She'd invited him here, and she had no idea what was coming. As the door swung open, a smile played on his lips. But this was no ordinary party. This was the moment that would decide everything. The question was, how far would Isabella go to keep her secret? We will know soonest, but before we do, let me know in the comment section where you are watching from, and do not forget to like, share and subscribe to this channel by that you will get notified when cooked beautiful stories like this. Let's go. The rain beat down on the window like 1,000 tiny soldiers marching against the glass. Antonio sat in his leather chair, the smooth surface of his desk reflecting the faint glow of the desk lamp. The room was dark, save for the flickering light, casting long shadows on the walls of his office. His fingers drummed steadily against the surface, the rhythm echoing in the silence that had settled around him. Outside, the world was chaotic, but inside, Antonio's empire thrived in the controlled stillness he had carefully crafted. A feared Mafia boss, he was a man whose name stirred dread in those who crossed him and commanded loyalty from those who served him. He was both a businessman and a criminal mastermind, with an iron grip on everything from construction projects to underground dealings. Yet there was one thing in his life that had always eluded him: peace at home. His wife, Isabella, had been distant for months now. Once she was the woman who captivated him with her beauty and intellect, someone who understood the balance between loyalty and independence. But over time something had shifted. She was no longer the vibrant woman who greeted him at the door with a kiss. Now she was a shell of the woman he had married. Long hours at the office, weekend meetings, cryptic client dinners. Each excuse, each hollow smile she offered him, left a wound deeper than the last. And though he'd always trusted her, the more he saw of her detachment, the more suspicion began to creep into his heart. Antonio's eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. Another hour had passed, and Isabella still wasn't home. He was used to her late nights, but tonight, he felt the weight of something he couldn't shake. The unease gnawed at him, something that had been building for weeks. Then the door to his office opened, and Isabella stepped inside, her heels clicking on the polished floor. She was dressed in a sleek black dress that clung to her form like a second skin. Her dark hair cascaded down her back, and though she was undeniably stunning, there was a coldness to her that Antonio had never seen before. "Good evening, Antonio," she said, her voice polite but distant, like a stranger trying to maintain cordiality. "Isabella," he said, his voice low and measured. He watched her closely, his sharp eyes noting every subtle detail, the way she avoided his gaze, the slight fidgeting of her hands. He could feel her avoiding something, but she wasn't ready to face the truth. Not yet. She set down her purse, taking a seat opposite him at the desk. Her fingers idly traced the edges of a stack of papers, her eyes unfocused, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. "I got an invitation today," she said, glancing up at him. "To a corporate party. It's for my boss, Gregory's company. It's this Friday. They're celebrating some milestone." Antonio's gaze never wavered. "You're going?" Her hesitation was barely perceptible, but he caught it. Her lips parted as if searching for the right words to explain, and in that moment something shifted in him, an instinct he couldn't ignore. I thought I should go," she said finally, her voice trailing off. "It's important for my career. You know how these things are." She said the words with the practiced indifference of someone who had rehearsed them, and yet the cracks in her performance were obvious. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tightening around the armrests. "Isabella, do you want me to go with you?" His question was casual, but there was an underlying weight in his voice, a quiet challenge. She met his eyes for a fleeting moment before looking down at her lap. I thought I'd go alone," she said, her voice almost too soft. "It's a work event, Antonio. It's better if you don't come. You know how they are. They wouldn't understand." A flicker of irritation sparked in Antonio's chest. The weight of her words hung in the air, but the way she said them, like she was trying to keep him at arm's length, cut deeper than any betrayal could. He had always been protective of Isabella, but this felt different. This felt like something more than just work. He studied her for a moment longer, and when she failed to meet his gaze, his suspicion deepened. "Is that so?" he murmured, his voice smooth, but there was a dangerous edge to it. His tone, though controlled, carried the unmistakable weight of authority. "I'll think about it," he added, standing up and walking toward the bar in the corner of the room. He poured himself a drink, his movements slow and deliberate, his mind already working through the possibilities. The situation didn't sit right with him. There was more to this than Isabella was telling him, and he was determined to find out what it was. Isabella stood as well, her eyes nervously flicking toward the door. She opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, Antonio cut her off. "I'm going to the party," he said, his voice final. "I'll be there. To see what's going on. To see who you're really dealing with." She froze, her hand hovering over her purse as if she was about to protest but thought better of it. A quiet tension simmered between them. Antonio wasn't asking for permission. He wasn't asking for anything. He was taking control. He turned back to her, his gaze piercing. "I've been patient, Isabella. But I'll be there. You can't keep me in the dark." Her eyes flashed with something, regret? Fear? But she quickly masked it with a smile. "It's just a corporate event, Antonio. Nothing more." But Antonio wasn't convinced. Not anymore. The Mafia boss world had always been built on trust and loyalty. And when that trust was shaken, the consequences were far-reaching. But this time, it wasn't just business. It was personal. His own home was starting to unravel, and he was going to find out exactly what was happening, no matter the cost. As the night stretched on and the rain continued to pour outside, Antonio prepared himself for the party. He didn't know what he would find there, but he did know this. Isabella had already crossed a line. Whether she knew it or not, the game had changed. And Antonio wasn't about to let anyone play him for a fool. As the night stretched on and the rain continued to pour outside, Antonio prepared himself for the party. He didn't know what he would find there, but he did know this. Isabella had already crossed a line. Whether she knew it or not, the game had changed. And Antonio wasn't about to let anyone play him for a fool. He donned a tailored dark suit, the fabric crisp and sharp against his body. Every movement, every decision was deliberate. Antonio wasn't someone who just walked into a room. He owned the space the moment he stepped through the door. He checked himself in the mirror one last time, smoothing the edges of his perfectly combed dark hair. His appearance was understated but commanding. The simplicity of his attire, paired with his cold, hard eyes, sent a message. He didn't need a flashy suit to show his power. His presence did all the talking. The car ride to the venue was short, the rain cascading down in sheets as the city lights blurred behind the windshield. But it was in those few moments of stillness that Antonio's thoughts roiled with a quiet fury. He didn't like being in the dark. And tonight, Isabella was about to learn just how much that irritated him. As he entered the building, the soft murmur of voices, the clinking of glasses, and the light jazz music that played in the background all came to a sudden, subtle halt. Heads turned. Eyes followed. Antonio's presence was magnetic, impossible to ignore. His reputation preceded him even in these corporate halls, and though he wore no overt signs of his criminal empire, the weight of his influence was unmistakable. It wasn't the suit. It wasn't the car. It wasn't even the cold, calculating expression he wore. It was the way he carried himself, like a lion entering a room full of sheep. They sensed it immediately. Isabella stood near the bar, talking to a small group of colleagues. Her back was straight, her smile perfectly practiced, but there was a nervousness in her eyes that Antonio didn't miss. The moment she saw him, her smile faltered, just for a second, but it was enough. The kind of hesitation that only someone who's been caught doing something they shouldn't would have. Antonio's gaze drifted over to her coworkers, and what he saw made his stomach tighten. They looked at him with a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and, to his growing unease, disdain. Whispers began to float around the room like smoke, too quiet for anyone to hear outright but loud enough for him to feel them. He was an outsider in a world he didn't belong to. For the first time in his life, He felt the sting of being beneath someone's gaze, not out of fear, but of subtle, condescending judgment. He watched as Isabella's colleagues subtly adjusted their posture, straightened their ties, and exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Her boss, Gregory, stood in the center of the group, a smug smile spreading across his face as he made eye contact with Antonio. It wasn't the kind of look you gave a man of equal status. It was the look one gives to an interloper, a reminder that you're on the outside looking in. Antonio's eyes narrowed, and he moved through the crowd, each step measured, deliberate, like a predator on the hunt. Isabella noticed his approach and immediately excused herself from the group. She met him halfway, her voice forced as she greeted him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Antonio, I didn't expect you to come," she said, her words coming out too quickly. "I thought you'd change your mind." "I don't change my mind, Isabella," he said, his voice calm, almost too calm. He could hear the slight quiver in her voice, the uncomfortable shift in her posture as she fidgeted with the stem of her wine glass. Before she could respond, Gregory appeared, slinking into the conversation like a predator sensing an opportunity. He was dressed to the nines in a tailored suit, his slicked-back hair gleaming under the dim lights. His sharp smile seemed to be permanently fixed to his face, and his eyes glinted with an arrogance that screamed privilege. "So this is the infamous Antonio," Gregory said, extending a hand with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Isabella's husband. Quite the surprise to see you here." Antonio shook his hand, his grip firm but not overbearing. He met Gregory's eyes with that cold, assessing look he reserved for people who underestimated him. Gregory was trying to size him up, but Antonio was not a man who could be pegged by looks or words alone. "Yes, I'm sure it's a surprise," Antonio said, his tone dripping with a quiet edge. "I tend not to show up to these things uninvited." Gregory chuckled, though it was clear that he wasn't fazed. If anything, the man seemed to take a strange pleasure in mocking him. "So, what brings you to the corporate world, Antonio? I assume you're here to show off your nightclub or maybe a little gambling venture. That's usually what men like you do, right?" The words hung in the air like acid. There was no mistaking the disdain in Gregory's voice. He was treating Antonio like an afterthought, a low-tier thug in a world of suits and ties, assuming that the Mafia boss was little more than a dirty work kind of guy, someone who didn't belong in a setting like this. Isabella's face flushed as she looked from Antonio to Gregory, her discomfort growing, but she said nothing. She didn't correct Gregory, didn't step in to defend him. The silence stretched on, thick and awkward. Antonio's eyes locked on Gregory's, the room's energy shifting as the Mafia boss took in the man's words and his attitude. Gregory was playing a dangerous game, not realizing just how close he was to crossing a line. But Antonio wasn't going to reveal that just yet. He would play his part and watch carefully, let Gregory dig his own hole. "I'm just here to support my wife," Antonio said, his voice even, his eyes never leaving Gregory's. "She's worked hard, and I wanted to see the company she's so passionate about." Gregory let out a fake condescending laugh, clearly enjoying the discomfort he was causing. "Well, I'm sure it's nice to have someone who understands the business side of things," he said, glancing at Isabella. "But I can imagine, Antonio, it must be tough, being married to someone who works harder than you. She's the one who keeps the lights on here, not you, right?" The words struck like a slap. The air in the room thickened, the laughter of the other colleagues growing louder, as if everyone in the group was in on some private joke. Isabella's smile faltered, but again she didn't correct him. She didn't stop him. Antonio felt his blood begin to boil, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he smiled, just enough to keep them guessing. "You're right," he said, his voice calm, controlled. "It feels great, especially since every paycheck she earns comes from my company." The room fell silent. The laughter died in their throats, and for a moment, Antonio could hear the sound of his own heartbeat. Gregory's face turned a shade lighter, his smile slipping just a fraction. "You what?" Gregory stammered, clearly trying to recover from the unexpected turn in the conversation. Antonio's gaze never wavered. "I own the company you manage, Gregory," he said coolly. "The properties, the projects, the profits you've been boasting about? They're all mine." Gregory opened and closed his mouth, struggling to find words, but none came. The people around them began to shift uncomfortably, their glances darting from one person to the next. Antonio turned his eyes to Isabella, whose face had gone white as she absorbed the weight of his words. She didn't know what to say. And that, for Antonio, was the final confirmation. He hadn't just been ignored. He had been mocked. The game was no longer about her work. It was about respect. And Gregory was about to learn the cost of disrespecting him. The minutes dragged on like hours as Antonio stood at the center of the group, the buzz of voices around him growing louder. His eyes never left Gregory. The man had no idea who he was dealing with, and yet here he was, digging deeper into a hole he would never escape from. Gregory's laughter had barely faded when he leaned back, eyes gleaming with malice, his smirk widening as he scanned Antonio, sizing him up like a piece of meat at a butcher's counter. "You know," Gregory said, his voice dripping with false camaraderie, "you don't see many guys like you around here. You're a relic from a different time, aren't you?" He chuckled lightly, throwing an exaggerated glance at the rest of the table, clearly enjoying the attention. "I bet you've got your hands in some, how do they say it? Business ventures. You know, the kind of things that keep the real money flowing, like casinos, nightclubs, maybe a few illegal operations tucked in the back." The words were dripping with condescension. Gregory had clearly made his judgment. In his mind, Antonio was just another outdated underworld figure, someone who didn't belong in a world of sleek power suits and corporate mergers. The world of deals made over fine wine and handshakes. Gregory didn't see a man who'd built an empire. He saw a thug with too many tattoos and too little class. And Antonio could feel every drop of venom that laced his words. The tension in the room thickened, the colleagues surrounding them now more like spectators at a circus, waiting for the next jab to land. Antonio could hear their muffled laughter, the uncomfortable shifting of their feet as they waited for him to react. They didn't know it, but they were all playing into a game they would never win. Antonio kept his face blank. The anger was simmering inside him, but he didn't let it show. He wasn't going to give Gregory the satisfaction of seeing him lose his cool. Not yet. His fists clenched under the table, but he didn't flinch. "I don't know about relics," Antonio said smoothly, his voice calm, low, almost detached. "But I do know that I've been in business long enough to understand the difference between men like you and men like me." He let the words hang in the air, watching Gregory's face carefully. He'd made the mistake of assuming Antonio was nothing more than a mobster. But tonight, Antonio was playing by his own rules. Gregory smirked, clearly unfazed. "Ah, I get it," he said with a half-laugh. "You're a throwback. Still stuck in the old ways. You know, things like threats and intimidation. I'm sure you don't know much about modern business practices. Like, you know, the way real power is made, board meetings, quarterly reports, data analysis. That's where the real action happens." He paused for effect, turning to the group. "But I suppose you're not really the boardroom type, are you?" The group around them chuckled, and Gregory shot a triumphant look at Isabella, as though he'd just scored some kind of point. Antonio watched Isabella's face closely. She looked away quickly, avoiding his gaze as her fingers nervously twirled the stem of her wine glass. She hadn't said a word. She hadn't even looked at him in the way she once did when she was proud of him. No, tonight she was silent, embarrassed by his presence, embarrassed to be near him. It wasn't just Gregory's words that hurt. It was the absence of any defense from Isabella. It was the way she stood there, her back straight, her expression tight. She hadn't once corrected Gregory, hadn't once stepped in to stop the insults. The way she ignored him, the coldness in her eyes, it was a silent betrayal. It gnawed at him. He could feel his pulse quicken, but he forced himself to remain still, to stay composed. He wasn't going to let this man get under his skin. Gregory didn't know the rules. He didn't know that a man who ruled an empire didn't need to defend himself. His reputation was enough. But Gregory's constant jabs, the mockery of everything Antonio stood for, were beginning to erode something inside him. "So," Gregory continued, his eyes glinting with amusement, "what's next, Antonio? Going to threaten me with a hit? You know, I've heard some stories. A man like you." He probably likes to make his problems disappear, doesn't he? He laughed again, but this time the sound was less sincere and more like the caw of a crow, too loud, too abrasive. At that, the room went silent for a moment, and Antonio could feel the eyes of the others on him, waiting for him to explode, to retaliate. The laughter was almost painful to hear. It was as though the room was daring him to rise to the occasion. But Antonio didn't rise. Instead, he smiled, a thin, cold smile that never reached his eyes. "Is that what you think?" Antonio said softly, almost too calmly. His voice was the calm before a storm, the eye of the hurricane. "You think you understand me? You think I'm some petty thug who solves problems with threats and violence?" He leaned forward, his face just inches away from Gregory's, his eyes locking onto the man's with unspoken menace. Gregory swallowed, suddenly unsure of the situation he'd so blithely orchestrated. But instead of retreating, he doubled down, trying to salvage his earlier bravado. "You're all talk," Gregory said, his voice faltering slightly. "But that's all you are, right? A big name with nothing behind it." Antonio's smile widened, but it wasn't a smile at all. It was the kind of smile that sent chills down the spine of anyone who understood real power. "You're wrong," Antonio said quietly. "I don't need to threaten anyone, Gregory. I've built my empire with something you'll never have: patience. You mock me because you think you're better. But the truth is, I don't need to prove anything to you. I have nothing to prove to anyone here." Gregory took a step back, his bravado slipping. But Antonio was done with games. He turned his attention back to Isabella, whose face was pale, her mouth slightly parted. "Isabella," Antonio said, his voice colder now, almost imperceptible beneath the hum of the conversation. "You seem uncomfortable. Are you okay?" Her eyes widened at the directness of his question, but she quickly masked it with a polite smile. "I'm fine, Antonio," she replied, though her voice trembled slightly. "Just a little tired, that's all." Antonio didn't respond immediately. He let the silence linger, feeling the weight of her words, feeling the distance between them grow with every moment. The tension in the room was thick now, like a fog that refused to lift. Gregory's earlier mockery had become a bitter aftertaste, and the conversation faltered in the aftermath of Antonio's cold calm. As the evening continued, the jokes about Mafia stereotypes didn't stop. Gregory continued his tirade, trying to paint Antonio as nothing more than an old-fashioned, obsolete criminal, completely out of touch with the modern world. The others laughed, the discomfort in Isabella's eyes growing with each passing moment. Antonio, despite the storm brewing inside him, didn't let his anger show. He wasn't here to react. He was here to observe. And with every joke, every word, he was beginning to understand just how far this betrayal went. But it wasn't just the jokes that stung. It was the silence from the woman he had loved, the one person who should have been standing by him. His place in her world was becoming clearer by the second. It was a place he no longer belonged. And yet, he stayed. For now. The evening had already stretched into uncomfortable hours, the laughter in the air now strained and hollow. Antonio could feel it. Gregory's presence, once a nuisance, had become a full-blown irritation. The mocking had started light enough, just jabs and jests, but it was clear now that Gregory was trying to prove something. The more he pushed, the more the atmosphere thickened, and it became harder for Antonio to ignore the growing sense of discomfort in his chest. His patience, always his greatest strength, was beginning to fray. Isabella was quieter now, her forced smiles becoming more frequent, more mechanical. Antonio caught her eyes a few times throughout the night, but each time she looked away. It was as if she was trying to avoid him, retreating into her professional persona to shield herself from the tension. And he hated it. Gregory, on the other hand, was in his element, leaning back in his chair, grinning as though he'd just won some great victory. His jabs were becoming bolder, more frequent. He wasn't just mocking Antonio anymore. He was humiliating him in front of Isabella and her colleagues, desperate to establish his dominance. The crowd around them had shifted from polite laughter to something more pointed. Every time Gregory made a crack at Antonio's expense, the others followed suit, chuckling nervously, exchanging glances, unsure whether to laugh too loudly or stay silent. But all the while, the room buzzed with a palpable sense of discomfort. It was as if everyone was waiting for something to break. Gregory took another swig of his drink, his eyes gleaming with that familiar arrogance as he turned toward Antonia. "You know, Antonia," he said, a wicked grin curling his lips. "I'm curious. How does it feel knowing your wife makes more money than you? I mean, she's really the one holding this company together, huh? You must be proud of her, right?" He looked around the table, his gaze bouncing from colleague to colleague, as if he were delivering some great truth that everyone should appreciate. A few chuckles rose around the room, and Antonio could feel the heat rising in his chest. He hadn't expected it to get this far, but here they were. Gregory, the man who thought he could step all over him, was boldly asserting his dominance, tearing into him like some prize to be claimed. Isabella, her face flushed with discomfort, remained silent, her gaze darting nervously between Gregory and Antonio. Antonio's patience finally snapped. He sat in his chair, his hand gripping the edge of the table, but he made no movement. He had learned long ago to keep his body language in check, to remain calm, even when the fury inside him was roaring. But this was different. This wasn't just about him. This was about respect. His respect. Isabella's respect. And Gregory had crossed a line. Slowly, deliberately, Antonio stood up. The room went still, the chatter falling into an awkward hush as everyone turned to him. Gregory froze, clearly not expecting this kind of reaction. The smug grin on his face faltered for the briefest moment, and in that split second, Antonio saw his chance. He was done being humiliated. "Gregory," Antonio said, his voice cool but edged with an unmistakable weight. He paused, letting the silence settle before continuing. "You're right. Isabella does great work. I'm proud of her. She's been the backbone of this company in more ways than you could ever understand." His eyes never left Gregory's, the calmness in his voice belying the controlled fury behind his words. "But you're wrong if you think she's the only reason this place is thriving." Gregory, for all his bravado, blinked. For the first time that night there was doubt in his eyes. The room felt smaller now, the space between them charged with tension. Antonio's words hung in the air, each syllable measured and deliberate. "You see, Gregory," Antonio continued, his voice now a low rumble, "you don't understand the first thing about this company, about what it really takes to keep it running." He took a step forward, his gaze narrowing. "And you don't understand what you're dealing with when it comes to me." Gregory's expression shifted from confidence to confusion. He opened his mouth as though to say something, but the words didn't come. He was caught off guard, unsure of how to respond. Antonio didn't give him the chance. "This company, this empire you think you manage, Gregory, was built from the ground up. Every dollar, every deal, every acquisition, it's mine. It's been mine from the start. And Isabella's a big part of that. She's the one keeping the gears turning, I'll give you that. But without me, this whole thing wouldn't exist." Antonio's voice was steady, unwavering, but there was an undeniable finality to his words. "So before you open your mouth again, thinking you can mock me, you should know something." Gregory stared at him, his face paling as the gravity of Antonio's words began to sink in. The room was dead silent now. The laughter, the jabs, the mockery. They were all gone, swallowed by the weight of the truth. Antonio paused, letting the silence stretch between them for just a moment longer, enjoying the disarray he'd caused. He could feel the room shift. The whispers that had once been so confident, so mocking, had turned to something else. Fear. Disbelief. Wonder. They all wanted to know more, but they all knew better than to ask. The game had changed, and they were suddenly playing in Antonio's world. He turned to Isabella, his eyes locking with hers. For a moment, he saw the flash of guilt in her eyes, the shame that she had tried so desperately to mask. She didn't say anything, but her expression spoke volumes. And in that moment, Antonio understood. She had known, she had always known. She just hadn't wanted to admit it to herself, let alone anyone else. But this wasn't about her, not entirely. It wasn't even about Gregory anymore. It was about respect. And Gregory had none. I've stayed in the shadows long enough, Antonio said, his words now a soft growl, the finality of his tone settling in like a storm cloud. I've let you think what you want, let you think that I'm some washed-up relic of the past. But this company, it's mine. The money you're pocketing, the deals you're so proud of, the projects you tout, all mine. He looked back at Gregory, whose face had turned a pale shade of white. You don't get to mock me anymore. Gregory tried to stammer something, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't find them. He couldn't move. And in that instant Antonio knew he had won. The atmosphere in the room was thick with anticipation. The colleagues who had once mocked him were now frozen, their eyes wide. Isabella was silent, but Antonio could see the fear in her eyes. Fear and maybe something else, regret perhaps. Or maybe just realization. Antonio straightened, his posture commanding the room. I'll let you finish your little game, Gregory. But know this. The next time you make the mistake of thinking you can humiliate me in front of my wife, you'll regret it. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Gregory and the stunned guests behind him. The night wasn't over, but for Antonio, it had already been decided. The evening had worn on, the small talk growing more strained, the laughs increasingly hollow. Antonio could feel the temperature shift as he sat at the table, watching Gregory continue to parade his self-important attitude. The man didn't even seem to notice the room's growing discomfort, still laughing, still throwing jabs at Antonio in a manner so casual, so sure of his own superiority. But as dessert arrived, small elegant bites of dark chocolate mousse and fruit tarts, it was as though time itself paused. The murmur of conversation quieted for a moment, and Antonio felt the weight of the situation pressed down on him like a hand on his chest. Every conversation in the room had been about him, whether directly or indirectly. People didn't just whisper behind his back, they had been openly mocking him. But now it was time for the truth to come out. It was time for them to know exactly who they were dealing with. The moment he stood up, the noise in the room stilled. Every eye turned to him, and the air grew thick with expectation. Antonio was no longer the subject of the jokes, no longer the man to be ridiculed. He took a slow breath, straightened his shoulders, and let the silence grow as he calmly addressed the room. His voice was low and even, but there was a force behind it that could not be ignored. I built this company from the ground up, he said, his words clear and steady. Everything you boast about, every acquisition, every project, every single one of them, I'm the one who funded it. He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. This place, this company you all work for, wasn't built by Gregory's so-called leadership. It was built by me. The effect was immediate and jarring. Gregory, who had been leaning back in his chair, still smug and comfortable, went pale. His face, once the picture of arrogant self-assurance, slowly transformed into one of confusion, disbelief, and then something deeper, fear. His eyes darted from Antonio to the rest of the table, but no one was laughing now. No one was mocking Antonio. The room, once filled with murmurs and forced politeness, had gone completely silent. Even the clinking of silverware against plates stopped. Every person in the room, Isabella included, now looked at Antonio with a mixture of shock and realization. The man they had assumed was just a small-time thug had just revealed himself to be the true mastermind, the puppet master pulling the strings of everything they had been working to build. The air felt thick with uncertainty. Isabella's eyes locked on Antonio, and for the first time all evening, there was no avoiding the look of guilt that flashed across her face. Her hand trembled slightly as she placed it down on the table, the fork in her grasp now forgotten. She looked from Antonio to Gregory and back again, her mouth slightly agape, her breath catching in her throat. Antonio didn't look at her right away. His gaze was fixed firmly on Gregory, who now seemed to shrink in his seat. Gregory's earlier bravado had evaporated like smoke, and Antonio could almost see the wheels turning in his head, trying to reconcile the man in front of him with the image he had built of him. Antonio could feel Gregory's panic creeping up, but he refused to show it. He refused to acknowledge any weakness in front of the people he had been mocking all night. Isabella finally spoke, her voice a whisper, her words strained. Antonio, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell anyone? The words were soft, but they cut through the tension like a knife. Antonio's eyes moved from Gregory to Isabella, and he finally spoke directly to her. "You should have told them, Isabella. But I wanted to see who you'd become when you thought I wasn't watching." His voice was calm, but there was a coldness to it that made her flinch. She stood up, her face pale, her hands suddenly trembling. "Antonio, I didn't think." Her voice faltered, unsure of what to say, the weight of her silence now too much to bear. Antonio's gaze hardened, his eyes narrowing. "You didn't think. But you knew. You knew who I was. And you chose to hide it, just like everyone else here." He gestured to the table, where the colleagues now shifted nervously in their seats, unsure of what to do next. "You're all the same. So quick to judge and mock without understanding who you're dealing with." Gregory, trying to salvage whatever pride he had left, attempted to speak. He cleared his throat, his voice strained, desperate. "Antonio, this isn't what I meant. Antonio cut him off, his voice like steel. "Shut up, Gregory. You've made your point. But now you'll listen." Gregory's mouth closed, and the room seemed to collectively hold its breath. Antonio had taken control, and there was no going back. Antonio's words were quiet, but every person in the room could feel the weight of them. "You think you know business, Gregory? You think you're some sort of corporate genius? You think you built this company?" Antonio took a step forward, leaning slightly toward Gregory, his voice lowering. "You didn't. You were a pawn in my game. And now it's time to move you off the board." Gregory's expression faltered. He wasn't prepared for this. No one was. The colleagues who had been so eager to join in on the jabs at Antonio were now looking at him with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. The confidence they had felt earlier was gone, replaced by something far more powerful: awareness. They were in the presence of someone who had shaped their lives, who had built the very foundation they had been standing on, and yet they had mocked him. They had belittled him. Isabella, still standing at the table, looked around at the others, her eyes wide, her face drained of color. She looked at Antonio, then back at Gregory. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her mind raced, but she was too far gone to take it all back. The shock of the revelation was heavy, suffocating. The truth hung in the air like a cloud, casting a shadow over the rest of the evening. Gregory's smirk had completely disappeared. The once cocky executive was now a shell of his former self, standing before Antonio like a man condemned. Antonio turned to Isabella one last time, his voice softer but still firm. "I wanted to see who you were when you thought I wasn't watching, Isabella. Now I see." The moment was heavy with finality. The room remained silent, the tension thick in the air, as Gregory struggled to regain some semblance of control. But it was too late. The game had changed, and Antonio had made his move. No one in that room would forget what they had learned tonight. The company's true owner had been revealed. And now there was no going back. The tension in the room was suffocating. Antonio's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, each syllable carefully chosen, each pause deliberate. Gregory was frozen, his face drained of color, his earlier confidence shattered into a million pieces. The room was so still that even the soft clink of silverware seemed like a distant echo. Antonio stood tall, his posture perfect, his eyes like ice. Beneath the calm exterior, there was a fury brewing, cold and methodical, like a storm waiting to be unleashed. But Antonio wasn't one for outbursts. His anger didn't need to be screamed. It was felt in the quiet assurance of his presence. And right now, Gregory was the target of that quiet fury. The man had mocked him, humiliated him in front of his wife and colleagues, all while underestimating the very man whose money had built the empire Gregory now ran. He had made one fatal mistake. He thought Antonio was just a thug, a relic of the past, easy to belittle. Antonio's gaze never wavered as he took a step forward, closing the distance between him and Gregory. The others in the room seemed to hold their breath, unsure of what would come next. Isabella's eyes were wide, her face a mask of fear and confusion, as she looked at Antonio, then at Gregory and back again. She could feel the shift in the room, could feel how everything had changed in a matter of seconds. "You've mocked my wife," Antonio began, his voice cold but steady. "You've belittled her achievements, treated her like a second-rate employee in a company she built. You've undermined everything she's worked for, all while prancing around like you're some kind of genius. And as if that wasn't enough, you've treated your colleagues like pawns in your game, using them, humiliating them to elevate yourself." Gregory opened his mouth, his hands trembling slightly, but no words came out. He had no defense. His arrogance had turned to something else now. Fear. He knew the gravity of what Antonio was saying. This wasn't just about an insult or a misstep anymore. This was a matter of survival. Antonio took another step closer, his voice lowering to a deadly whisper. "You will pay for it." The words hung in the air like a promise, a quiet declaration of war. Gregory's eyes flickered to the others at the table, seeking some kind of support, but there was none. No one dared to speak up. Isabella stood motionless, her face pale, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent. Gregory, still desperate to salvage his dignity, opened his mouth again, this time stammering through a pitiful attempt at an apology. "Antonio, I didn't mean it. I didn't know you were. Look, I apologize, okay?" Gregory's voice was frantic now, the self-assured bravado gone, replaced by a sense of vulnerability he had never shown before. This was all just a joke. I didn't mean to disrespect you or Isabella. I was just trying to fit in, to make light of things. Please, I'm sorry. Let's put this behind us." But Antonio wasn't listening to him anymore. He wasn't interested in apologies or weak justifications. His eyes burned with an intensity that cut through Gregory's words, making them seem insignificant. He wasn't here for excuses. He wasn't here for redemption. He was here to settle this once and for all. "You think an apology is enough?" Antonio asked, his voice growing darker, his tone sharpening like a knife. "You think you can just waltz in here and mock me, mock my wife, and then wave it all away with a few empty words? No, Gregory. There are consequences to your actions. And tonight you will face them." Gregory's shoulders slumped as he realized the severity of the situation. There was no bargaining here, no way out. Antonio's authority was undeniable, and Gregory, for the first time that night, understood that his position, his power, had been built on nothing but sand. And now the tides were shifting, threatening to swallow everything. Antonio's voice remained cold and calm, but every word carried weight. "I'm giving you a choice, Gregory. You'll resign by Monday morning. You'll hand in your resignation, and you'll leave this company before it's too late. If you do, I'll let you walk away with some shred of dignity. But if you don't—" He let the silence hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "I'll make sure the world knows exactly who you are and what you've done. I'll make sure your career ends tonight." The words were final, irrevocable. The ultimatum hung in the air like a challenge, daring Gregory to speak, to do something, anything to try to save himself. But Gregory, now completely deflated, had nothing left. The smug arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a man who was trapped, unable to escape the consequences of his own actions. For a long moment no one spoke. The room was so quiet that Antonio could hear the faint sound of his own heartbeat, steady and strong. Gregory's mouth opened and closed, his mind racing for some way to salvage the situation, but no words came. He looked at Antonio, then at Isabella, who was standing in the corner of the room, her face pale and tear-streaked. He glanced around at the others at the table, but they were all looking down, avoiding eye contact, unwilling to offer him the support he so desperately sought. Isabella, her voice shaking, took a step toward Antonio. "Antonio, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Don't do this. You can't." Antonio turned to her, his gaze as cold as ever. With a single look, he silenced her, his expression hardening. "This is between me and him, Isabella," he said softly, but there was no mistaking the finality in his voice. "I don't expect loyalty from your boss. But I do expect it from you." Her eyes widened at his words, and for a moment she looked as if she wanted to say something more, to defend Gregory, to make some excuse, but she remained silent. She could see it now, the full extent of Antonio's power, his control. He wasn't just a man she had married. He was a force, a man who had the world at his feet, and she had unknowingly underestimated him. Antonio turned back to Gregory, his eyes cold as ice. The choice is yours. Resign by Monday, or I'll make sure the entire industry knows what kind of man you really are. Either way, you'll be done here. You'll never work in this business again. Gregory's face had gone ashen, and his eyes darted around the room, as if searching for some sign of hope. But there was none. He was trapped. He could feel the walls closing in around him, and all he could do was nod, too scared to say anything else. Good, Antonio said with a chilling smile, turning away. You'll have your answer by then. Without another word, Antonio walked away, leaving Gregory standing there in stunned silence. Isabella's eyes followed him, her heart heavy with confusion and guilt, but she remained silent. The room was still, and no one dared to speak as the weight of what had just happened settled in. Gregory was done, and Antonio had made sure of it. The night was far from over, but the message was clear. In Antonio's world, there were no second chances for those who crossed him. The sound of Antonio's footsteps echoed in the quiet hallway as he made his way toward the exit, each step deliberate, each motion filled with an air of finality. He didn't look back, not at the faces frozen in disbelief, not at the room full of stunned colleagues, and certainly not at Isabella, who stood there, speechless, her face a mix of confusion and something deeper, guilt. The weight of the evening was too heavy to carry, but Antonio, somehow, was unaffected by the collective shock behind him. He pushed open the door and stepped out into the cool night air. The rain had stopped, but the city streets glistened beneath the streetlights, slick with moisture. Antonio breathed in deeply, the air crisp against his skin, the quiet hum of the city replacing the stillness of the party. The car was waiting for him at the curb, the driver already anticipating his needs. Antonio slid into the back seat, leaning back against the leather seat. His eyes were closed for a moment, his mind running a quiet assessment of what had just transpired. Gregory's humiliation, Isabella's shock, the stunned silence in the room. It was all part of the game. But it was the look in Isabella's eyes that lingered. That look, the betrayal, the confusion, was what stayed with him. When they arrived home, the house was quiet, almost too quiet. The lights in the foyer were dim, casting soft shadows across the walls. Antonio stepped inside, his shoes clicking lightly against the marble floor. His mind was still on the party, but now there was a different kind of weight pressing down on him. It wasn't Gregory's humiliation or the fallout from the company. It was Isabella. She hadn't followed him back immediately, not at first. He knew she was standing at the door, unsure whether to follow or to leave him alone. But the silence didn't last long. Within minutes, Isabella came into view, her face pale, her posture stiff, and her eyes filled with questions. She stood in the doorway of the living room, watching him with the same uncertainty she had carried all evening. Antonio, she started, her voice small, tentative. I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me the truth? Why didn't you tell me who you were? Her question hung in the air between them, the words sharp, cutting through the distance that had grown between them over the course of the evening. Her eyes searched his face, looking for some kind of explanation. But there was none, not the way she expected. Antonio didn't answer right away. Instead, he took off his jacket and placed it over the back of a chair. He stood still for a moment, staring at her, and then, with a controlled exhale, he finally spoke. His voice was calm, but it carried a weight of finality, as if the decision had been made long before the night unfolded. I wanted to see who you would become when you thought I wasn't watching, Antonio said quietly, his gaze unwavering. His words weren't harsh, but they were honest, cutting through the confusion in the room with the sharpness of a blade. I gave you the benefit of the doubt, Isabella. I gave you time. I wanted to see if you would stand by me, if you would show loyalty. You failed me. Her breath caught in her throat as the words hit her. Isabella flinched, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to be so cold, so distant. But his eyes were hard, devoid of the warmth they once held. The man standing in front of her wasn't the Antonio she had known. the one who had stood by her side through thick and thin. No, this Antonio was different, and she could feel the shift in the space between them. "I wasn't hiding anything from you," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "I didn't think you needed to know. I thought you wouldn't want to be involved with all of this world. I never wanted to bring you into it." Antonio's expression softened just the slightest bit, but it wasn't enough. "I'm not talking about that, Isabella. It's not about being involved in your work. It's about the way you've treated me, the way you've let others think I'm nothing, the way you've kept me in the dark." His voice grew colder again, the words more measured. "You let Gregory mock me. You let him insult me in front of everyone. And you did nothing." Isabella's chest tightened. The truth stung, more than she was prepared for. He was right, of course. She had stood there silent, letting the mockery continue, unsure of how to defend him. Part of her wanted to speak out, but the rest of her had been terrified of the consequences, of how others would view her, of the world she had built for herself. She had kept her distance from Antonio, tried to maintain some level of control over her life. But now, in the aftermath, she saw just how far that distance had grown, and how much it had cost them both. "I didn't know what to say," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want to make things worse. I didn't know what you wanted from me." Antonio turned away, walking to the window, his back to her. "What I wanted, Isabella, was for you to stand with me, for you to stand up for me. But you didn't. And now everything is different." He stood there for a long moment, the only sound in the room the faint hum of the city outside, the soft glow of the streetlights casting a muted shadow across the room. Isabella stood frozen, unable to move. She didn't know how to fix this. She didn't know how to undo the distance that had been created between them, the walls that had been built by years of silence, of omission. Antonio turned to her again, his eyes filled with something she hadn't seen before, an impenetrable calm, an emotional distance that left no room for explanation. "I'm not angry, Isabella. I'm not even hurt. I've just come to a realization." She took a step forward, her voice trembling. "What realization?" "That I can't keep pretending like everything is fine. I've been patient, I've watched, I've given you chances. But I can't do it anymore. You've shown me who you are." He paused, his words lingering in the space between them. "And I have to live with that now." The words landed like a punch to her gut. Isabella stood in place, the tears welling up in her eyes, but she didn't speak. What could she say? He had already made his decision. And deep down, she knew it was too late to take anything back. Without another word, Antonio turned and walked toward the guest room. His steps were measured, deliberate, leaving Isabella standing in the hallway, unable to reach him. The distance between them had never felt more vast. He wasn't angry, but the clarity in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. There was no going back. As he entered the guest room and closed the door behind him, Isabella remained in the hallway, her heart heavy with guilt. The quiet between them now felt unbearable, the space between them vast and unbridgeable. And for the first time, she understood that nothing would ever be the same again. She couldn't reach him anymore. Not tonight. And maybe never again. The sound of the door closing was the final echo of a chapter that had ended, and Isabella was left standing in the emptiness, the weight of her choices pressing down on her more than ever before. The morning after the party, the news spread like wildfire through the office. It didn't take long for word to get out that Gregory had resigned, and the whispers began almost immediately. By the time the first few employees walked into the office, they had already heard the rumors. Gregory, the arrogant and smug manager who had made a name for himself by belittling everyone around him, was no longer with the company. The resignation was swift, almost too swift. No one knew exactly why, but the speculation ran rampant. Some people claimed that Gregory had been forced out. Others whispered that he had been given a choice: leave or face public exposure. But whatever the truth was, it was clear that Gregory's once prominent position had been erased in a single night. The atmosphere in the office was tense, the usual hum of activity now replaced by an uneasy quiet. Employees exchanged glances, their faces a mix of curiosity and fear. It was as if a storm had passed through, leaving behind a quiet wreckage. Gregory, the man who had mocked so many, was gone, and those who had once towed his line were now looking over their shoulders, wondering who might be next. Isabella sat at her desk, her hands trembling as she scrolled through emails she could hardly focus on. The workday had started, but her mind was elsewhere, far away from the spreadsheets and the tasks that needed her attention. It was the morning after the party, and the weight of everything that had transpired pressed heavily on her chest. Gregory's resignation was now official. Everyone in the office was talking about it, some in hushed tones, others openly speculating about what had really happened. But what really consumed Isabella wasn't the gossip. It was the harsh reality of what she had lost. She had seen Antonio's anger last night, seen how cold and distant he had become. And now it was clear. He had drawn a line, and she had crossed it. She hadn't been able to fix things with him. Not yet. Antonio was a man who operated on trust, and she had failed him when he needed her most. Last night had made that painfully clear. Her phone buzzed on the desk, snapping her from her thoughts. It was a text from Antonio. "Meet me for lunch. 12 p.m. Don't be late." The words were simple, but Isabella's stomach churned as she read them. There was no warmth in them. No love. Just the cold, direct nature of a man who had seen through the mask she had been wearing for far too long. She quickly typed back, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I'll be there." But what would she say? How could she explain her silence? Her hesitation? Antonio wasn't the man to forgive easily, and the trust between them, once solid and unshakable, had shattered in an instant. She knew that what she had done couldn't be undone with a few words. By the time 12 p.m. arrived, Isabella had arrived at the restaurant. She stood outside, her mind racing. Her heels clicked against the floor as she walked inside, her heart in her throat. She didn't see him right away, but she knew he was there, waiting for her as always. Antonio sat at a corner table, his back straight, his gaze already fixed on her. There was no warmth in his eyes, just the sharp focus of a man who had nothing to prove. He was waiting for her to take a seat, and when she did, the air between them felt thicker than it ever had before. Isabella opened her mouth to speak, but Antonio was quicker. He didn't let her offer an apology, didn't let her beg for forgiveness. Instead, he leaned forward, his tone calm, but there was an undeniable steel to it. "You know why you're here, Isabella. You're here because you've failed me. You failed to stand by me when it mattered most. You allowed others to mock me, to disrespect me, and you did nothing." Isabella's heart sank at the words. They were like a slap to the face, but she couldn't deny the truth in them. She had failed him, and now she had to live with the consequences. "I know," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to fix it. But I should have said something. I should have stood up for you." Antonio's eyes flickered, but the anger in them had dimmed. His expression softened, just a fraction, but the hardness still lingered. "It's too late for that now, Isabella. The damage has been done." A heavy silence hung between them as they both grappled with what had passed. Isabella's mind raced, trying to come up with the right words, trying to understand how things had come to this point. But there were no words that could change what had happened. "I didn't expect loyalty from your boss, Isabella. But I did expect it from you," Antonio continued, his voice unwavering. "And you failed me." "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her throat tightening with the weight of the apology. "But I can't undo it. I wish I could." Antonio stood, pushing his chair back with a soft scrape. He didn't look at her as he adjusted his jacket, his movements precise and controlled. "You've seen what happens when someone disrespects me," he said coldly. "Gregory found out the hard way. And now, you'll have to live with the consequences of your actions. I won't forgive what you did, Isabella. Not now, not ever." Her heart sank further as she watched him stand and turn to leave. But before he walked away, he stopped, his back still facing her. "You'll stay in the guest room tonight," he said. "I need space. We both need it." Isabella felt the sting of his words, but there was nothing she could say. Antonio had already made up his mind, and she knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one where the distance between them would grow further and further apart. As Antonio left the restaurant, his mind was already back on his empire that ran from the shadows, unseen, unfelt by those who didn't know the truth. His influence and control over the company were undisputed. Gregory's resignation was just the first sign of what happened when someone underestimated him. People didn't mock the Mafia boss. They didn't mock the man who controlled everything from the shadows. Antonio wasn't just a criminal mastermind. He was a businessman in his own right, and those who thought they could mock him, mock his wife, or mock his world, would pay the price. They always did. As the car pulled away from the curb, Antonio let out a long breath, his mind already working through the next steps. There was no turning back from this. Isabella had failed him. Gregory had failed him. But there was one thing Antonio knew. In his world, failure had a price. And now everyone knew it. He gazed out the window, the city passing by, but his thoughts remained on the future he would continue to shape from the shadows. The city outside the penthouse window glittered in the night, the lights casting long shadows across the room as Antonio stood there, his hands behind his back, lost in thought. The hum of the city below seemed so distant, as if it belonged to a different world. But in his mind, it was the only world that mattered. It had always been the only world. He wasn't angry anymore. That much was clear. The rage that had fueled his decision to confront Gregory, his decision to expose the truth to the office, and ultimately his decision to confront Isabella, had passed. What remained was a cold, quiet resolution. Antonio had made his choices. He had drawn his lines in the sand, and now he would live with them. For years, he had built his empire with meticulous care, always calculating, always in control. Whether it was in the criminal underworld or the corporate world, Antonio ruled with a singular iron fist. He had allowed Isabella to remain in his life, allowed her to remain unaware of the full extent of his power, because he wanted to believe in the loyalty that came with love. But loyalty, he had learned, was a fragile thing, easily shattered by silence, by the absence of defense when it mattered most. He turned from the window and walked toward the desk. There were papers to sign, meetings to schedule, deals to make. His world moved forward, and so would he. There was no time for second-guessing, no time for regret. But even as he worked through the motions of his day-to-day, Antonio couldn't help but reflect on the decisions that had led him here. He had given Isabella a chance. More than a chance, he realized. He had given her trust. And she had failed him. The betrayal was too deep for any apology to undo, too permanent for any words to fix. She had stood by, silent, as others mocked him, as others belittled him in front of his own wife. She hadn't defended him. She hadn't even tried to explain. And now, the silence between them stretched across the chasm that had once been their relationship. Antonio was not a man who sought revenge, nor was he a man who held grudges for petty reasons. But this wasn't petty. This was loyalty, a currency he valued above all else. And Isabella had broken that currency. What was left could never be repaired with a few tearful apologies. Isabella had tried to reach out to him, first with texts, then with phone calls. She had even shown up at his office, standing there in the doorway, looking at him with wide, pleading eyes. But Antonio remained impervious, his face unreadable, his eyes cold. She had apologized countless times. She had begged for forgiveness. She had explained the reasons behind her silence, the reasons behind her hesitation. But none of it mattered to him. Antonio didn't need reasons. He didn't need excuses. The moment she chose to stay silent was the moment she sealed her fate. Each time she reached out, Antonio's response was the same. Silence. Cold, impenetrable silence. He wasn't doing it out of malice. He wasn't punishing her out of anger. No, this was something else. It was a necessity. A man like Antonio couldn't afford weakness, not even in those he loved. And as much as he had once wanted to believe that Isabella was different, that she could be trusted, that she was his equal in a world built on loyalty, he knew now that the trust between them was gone. She had failed him when it mattered most, and there was no coming back from that. One evening, when Isabella showed up unannounced at the penthouse. Antonio had known she was coming. He had known that, eventually, she would show up to make one last attempt to mend the rift between them. But he was no longer the man he had been just a few days ago. He was standing by the bar, pouring himself a drink when she entered. Her face was a mixture of determination and sorrow, but when she saw him, her expression faltered. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were focused on the glass in his hand, as though he were contemplating something far more important than the woman standing before him. Isabella took a step forward, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Antonio, please," she whispered. "I need you to understand. I didn't mean to hurt you. He interrupted her with a simple gesture, a small dismissive wave of his hand. His gaze didn't even lift from the glass. "It's too late for explanations, Isabella," he said, his voice low, calm. "I've already made my decision." She stepped forward again, desperate, her voice breaking. "I failed you, I know. But I'm sorry. I've been nothing but selfish. I didn't think about what you needed. I thought I could do this on my own. But I was wrong. Please, just give me another chance." Antonio's hand clenched around the glass, but he didn't respond immediately. He stared into the amber liquid, his mind far away. Then, finally, he looked up at her, really looked at her for the first time in what felt like forever. The warmth that had once been in his gaze was gone. "The thing is, Isabella," he said, his tone almost too quiet, "I gave you every opportunity. I gave you the benefit of the doubt. But now I see you for what you really are." Her face faltered as the truth of his words hit her. She stepped back as though the weight of his words had physically struck her. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I know you didn't," Antonio replied, his voice colder now. "But that's not enough anymore. You failed me, Isabella. And now you'll have to live with the consequences." Isabella stood there, silent, the air thick with the finality of his words. She opened her mouth to say something more, but no words came. She couldn't fight this battle anymore. It was over. Antonio turned back toward the bar, pouring the last of the drink into his glass. His empire, both criminal and corporate, remained as steady as ever. He didn't need to explain himself. He didn't need to seek forgiveness. His world was built on power, control, and the quiet assurance that no one, would ever mock the king without facing the consequences. And as Isabella stood there, watching him, the truth finally settled in. She had lost him. She had lost everything. Antonio was untouchable now. His empire, his influence, remained his to command. And she was no longer a part of it. As she turned to leave, the door clicked softly behind her. The sound was final. Antonio, once again, remained unshaken. His empire was intact, his power undisputed. And so the story ended, not with rage or violence, but with a quiet, unspoken message. In Antonio's world, there were no second chances for betrayal. He would move forward, as always, from the shadows. Isabella would have to learn to live with the reality of her choices, and the future of their marriage would remain nothing more than a broken memory in the wake of his silent, unwavering power. As Isabella closed the door behind her, the soft click of the lock echoed in the hallway. Antonio didn't turn to look at her. The moment had passed, and with it, any chance for reconciliation. His empire, both criminal and corporate, remained unshaken. His influence was undeniable, and the world outside would never know the price it had cost to build it. He stood at the window, gazing out at the city that had always belonged to him, his kingdom. The lights below flickered like the distant glow of his empire, ever constant, ever watchful. No one could challenge him. Not Gregory, not Isabella, not anyone. The silence in the room was absolute. There was no anger in him, no regret. The clarity of his choices was his greatest strength. He had given loyalty, and he had expected it in return. But loyalty had been broken, and with it, his connection to Isabella. She was gone, not physically but emotionally. And in her absence, he had found something more important than love or companionship. Control. He looked at the glass in his hand. The ice now melted into nothing. Slowly, he placed it on the table and took a deep breath. This was the price of living in his world, a world where emotions had no place, where every decision was calculated, and where power was everything. He didn't feel relief or satisfaction, but he understood the price of everything. He knew who he was now, who he had always been. A man who would never be mocked, never be doubted. A king in a world of shadows, who ruled with an unflinching hand. As the last remnants of daylight faded from the city, Antonio walked to the window one last time. He didn't look back at the empty room behind him. There was nothing left to say, no more apologies to be given. In his silence, in his isolation, he was untouchable. He was the one who held all the cards, who held all the power. And the story of his empire would continue, without remorse, without regret. For in Antonio's world, there were no second chances, only consequences. And in the end, power was the only thing that remained.